In the oldest mountains on earth, something watches, etched in stone, buried in earth, hidden in shadow. From Carolina cliffs to Kentucky caves, the Appalachian spine holds secrets older than memory, serpents carved into soil, vanished civilizations, and symbols no one can read. Archaeologists dig, historians debate, the land stays silent, but the mystery grows louder. These aren't ghost stories, they're coordinates pointing to something we still don't understand and maybe never will. Welcome to 2 hours of ancient Appalachian enigmas science still can't explain. Bring a flashlight and don't look away too long. The mountains remember what we forget. Before we head into the hills, take a second to subscribe. It helps keep the lanterns lit for these long, strange journeys. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Missouri? Sunrise in Scotland? We want to know who's wandering the dark with us. 1. Judaculla Rock. On a sloping hillside in Jackson County, North Carolina, there sits a boulder that looks like it's been clawed by something not entirely of this world. The Judaculla Rock is no small affair. It's over 22 tons of soapstone, worn smooth by time, then defaced by time's older cousin. Etched into its surface are hundreds of glyphs, circles, lines, squiggles, hands with too many fingers. There are so many markings, in fact, that some parts of the rock look like ancient graffiti layered 10 times over. It's been called a map, a star chart, a warning, a diary of a vanished people, and then, more dramatically, a portal. But despite over a century of archaeological scrutiny, not a single interpretation has managed to shut the others up. The Cherokee, who have lived in the region for generations, do offer a more grounded story. In their oral tradition, the markings were made by Judaculla, a slant-eyed giant who ruled over the spirit world and the landscape alike. He leapt from the mountains to the valley, landing on the rock and gouging it with his seven-fingered hand. A warning, perhaps, or a signature, or both. His name still lingers like mist in these hills. Judaculla, Sulkalu, the master of game, a deity, a memory, a metaphor for a forgotten force, no longer welcome in polite academic circles. Scientists have carbon dated the soapstone quarries nearby and estimated that the carvings could be up to 3,000 years old, maybe older, but the truth is there is no single layer to peel back. The rock is a palimpsest. Multiple cultural groups across multiple centuries likely added to the surface, overlapping glyphs like they were stacking timelines, and that's precisely what makes it unsolvable. Any attempt to interpret the symbols as a unified message ends up arguing with itself. Even the arrangement of the figures resists sense. Some patterns resemble constellations, but not ones we know. Others form maze-like grids that no one can navigate. And then there are the glyphs that feel deliberately chaotic, fingerprints of intent that defy translation. It's as if whoever carved them didn't want to be understood. Not now, not ever. Preservation efforts have helped, but interpretation efforts have mostly circled the drain. Researchers with ground-penetrating radar, 3D imaging software, and a thesaurus full of optimistic hypotheses have all come up against the same wall. The meanings don't hold, they drift. One month, it's a prehistoric hunting calendar. The next, it's a boundary marker. The month after that, someone swears it's a Cherokee cosmogram that got misread for 1,000 years. It would be easier to dismiss the whole thing as ancient doodling, if not for one troubling fact. Many of the glyphs appear to repeat across the Southeast. Similar symbols show up in Alabama, Georgia, and Kentucky. Some are painted, others pecked, but they echo, which implies that there was a system, just not one we've ever managed to recover. And here's where it starts to sting. Maybe Judaculla Rock isn't obscure because it's ancient, but because it was never meant for us. We treat it like a message we deserve to read, scribbled across the landscape in a language no longer spoken. But maybe it wasn't a message. Maybe it was a barrier, and maybe it's working, because about 75 miles away, down the borderland between North Carolina and Tennessee, another message waits, not carved, but painted, just as indecipherable, just as old, and just as immune to our questions. 2. Paint rock pictographs. They don't look like much at first. You're standing on the craggy edge of the Appalachian Trail, the wind threading through rhododendron thickets, when someone gestures to a cliff wall and says, "There, see the red paint?" You squint, then you see them, rectilinear shapes in ochre and yellow, some stacked, others floating, thin lines that form no obvious picture, no friendly animal forms, no mythic beasts, just grids, angles, fragments, and you wonder if you're looking at art or instruction, and whether those two things were ever separate. The paint rock pictographs are among the few remaining painted rock art panels in the eastern U.S. Unlike petroglyphs, those are carved. Pictographs are painted onto stone, which makes them more fragile, more elusive, and far more likely to fade into invisibility over time. That they survived at all, exposed to rain, wind, and graffiti, is its own minor miracle. Archaeologists tentatively date the paint rock figures to around 1,000 years ago, maybe older. Some point to stylistic similarities with Mississippian or woodland-era art, while others argue the figures could be part of an entirely separate symbolic tradition, one we barely even know existed. No tools or burials were recovered from the site, no helpful middens, no signed cultural context, just color on stone and a long, dangerous drop below. The most obvious question, of course, is what are they for? The oldest guess is ritual. That's always a crowd pleaser, a place where shamans perform ceremonies, a sacred spot for vision quest or seasonal rites, perhaps a marker of where the spirit world overlaps with the human one, as some Cherokee elders suggest. But there's a darker possibility. The rectilinear patterns might not depict anything at all. They might be symbolic programs, like circuitry carved into the landscape, not meant to be seen so much as activated. A few researchers have proposed an archaeoacoustic hypothesis that the cliff face near the pictographs creates unique echoes when sound is projected toward it. If true, it could mean the art was part of a multisensory event, a sound and symbol ritual designed to alter consciousness, transmit knowledge, or open something best left closed. Not a show for onlookers, but a calibration for something older, quieter, and harder to map. But the problem is always the same. We are outsiders. Every test, every drone scan, every 3D model only gets us closer to the pigment, not to the painter. Oral traditions acknowledge the place but rarely explain it. The original meaning may have been secret by design, intended only for the initiated, and as those initiates vanished, so too did the instructions. Today, the paint rock pictographs are just barely protected, accessible but fragile, like a whisper you're not sure you were meant to hear. One good landslide and it's all gone, not destroyed, erased. And that's what unnerves people more than anything. We think of the past as permanent, but these aren't stone cities or pyramids. These are fingerprints on wet leaves, disappearing even as we look at them. And yet, there are others. To the south, in a quiet Georgia valley near Track Rock Gap, a whole field of carved symbols waits, more intricate, more numerous, and tangled in an even stranger debate. Because while archaeologists see native iconography, others, loud others, see ancient visitors from Mesoamerica. And that's where things start to get messy. If your brain's already spinning from carved serpents and lunar calendars, you're not alone, and we're just getting started. Take a second to subscribe if you haven't yet, so you don't miss what's still buried ahead. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Appalachian twilight, 3 a.m. insomnia scroll? We're listening. 3. Track Rock Gap petroglyphs. Track Rock Gap doesn't advertise itself. No neon signs, no glossy visitor center, just a gravel turnout off a winding forest road in the mountains of northern Georgia. You park, walk a few minutes into the woods, and there they are, half-buried slabs of stone scattered like bones in the dirt, each one carved with overlapping symbols, animals, human footprints, spirals, geometric grids, and creatures no field guide can confidently name. There are 6 known petroglyph boulders at the site, though some are little more than fragments of what they once were. Together, they form one of the largest rock art concentrations in the southeastern United States. They also form one of its loudest battlegrounds. Archaeologists say the petroglyphs were likely created by ancestors of the Creek and the Cherokee peoples. They probably date from around 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. The figures may relate to cosmology, clan symbols, hunting magic, or ceremonial storytelling. That's the polite explanation. The less polite one involves alleged Mayan priests, pre-Columbian contacts, and a healthy dose of academic eye-rolling. In the early 2000s, a small group of pseudo-archaeologists, internet theorists, and the occasional History Channel consultant began claiming that the track rock petroglyphs were proof of an ancient Mayan colony in Georgia. Their reasoning? A few abstract symbols vaguely resembled glyphs found on stelae in Mesoamerica. That was enough for some to declare a lost city in the Georgia mountains. They called it Itzamal, like the Yucatan site. They said it was covered up, literally, by the U.S. Forest Service. The Forest Service, to its credit, responded with a tactful but deeply exhausted statement. No, there is no secret Mayan temple here. Please stop digging holes in federal land. And yet, the rumor didn't die, because the real problem wasn't whether the Mayans were there. It was that no one could say for sure who was. And whenever there's a void in the record, someone rushes in to fill it with aliens, Atlanteans, or freelance prophets. What makes track rock so slippery is its ambiguity. The petroglyphs don't line up into a single style or sequence. They're cumulative, likely made over centuries by different people with different agendas. Some carvings are pecked, others scratched. Some are deep and deliberate, others faint as a shadow. There are thunderbird forms, bear tracks, spirals, and one particularly strange design that looks like a flower blooming inside a square. No one knows what that one means, but it shows up elsewhere in the region, like a signature without a name. Researchers using digital imaging have tried to reconstruct the full carving field, hoping to make sense of the chaos. But what they found is that the more you enhance the symbols, the less coherent they become. Figures overlap and contradict. Some carvings seem to intentionally obscure earlier ones, as if the site wasn't just a record, but a conversation or a disagreement. Some Cherokee elders suggest the site was once used for rites of passage or as a place where medicine people received visions. Others say it's a trail marker, less of a message, more of a memory anchor. The truth might be both, or neither, but here's the part that refuses to let go. The carvings don't face one direction. They're not arranged for viewing like a mural. Instead, they're distributed across sloping rocks that you have to physically walk around, bending, crouching, tilting your head. It's an art form that requires motion, which means interpretation wasn't passive, it was participatory. In other words, track rock wasn't made to be observed, it was made to be used. And that's where the modern lens starts to crack, because we keep trying to read these places like books, but maybe they're instruments, ritual tools, or worse, ritual maps. And if that's true, then we've long since forgotten what they were supposed to lead to. But not far away up a mountain that still growls in the wind, there's another mystery built of stone, one that doesn't just ask questions, it asks why it exists at all. 4. Fort Mountain's Stone Wall. There's a wall in Georgia that goes nowhere. It snakes along the crest of Fort Mountain for nearly 850 meters, made of piled unmortared stones, winding through trees like the ruined spine of something that once stood taller. No gates, no towers, no foundation of a fortress, just stone on stone, jagged and unmoved, as if the mountain itself tried to grow teeth. Locals call it the Fort Mountain Wall. The name implies defense, but there's nothing to defend against. No signs of battle, no remains of a settlement, and no practical reason to build a wall that follows no logical boundary. Archaeologists have been trying to make sense of it for over a century, and the best anyone can say is it's old, probably very old. Some theories suggest it's a ceremonial enclosure built by woodland or early Mississippian peoples. That would place it somewhere between 500 BCE and 500 CE, but there's no pottery, no post holes, no offerings. If it was ceremonial, the ceremony left no trace. And then there's the legend, the one that stubbornly won't die. The Cherokee spoke of the moon-eyed people, pale, short, and nearly blind in daylight. They were said to be the original inhabitants of the region, driven underground or driven out before the Cherokee arrived. Some versions say they built the wall. Others say they vanished into it. Most scholars dismiss the moon-eyed people as myth, a memory distorted by time, possibly an echo of earlier woodland cultures or an outsider group later mythologized. But the story sticks for one reason. The wall shouldn't be there, not at that height, not at that length, not without a visible reason. Geologists confirm the stones weren't quarried. They were gathered locally, dragged from scree and slope, some weighing over 100 pounds. No one builds something this useless by accident. Satellite surveys and LiDAR scans show irregular gaps and bulges in the wall, as if it wasn't meant to keep something out, but to mark something. Astronomical alignments have been proposed, solstice shadows, lunar standstills, even star paths. Nothing definitive holds. The mountain laughs at rulers. Still, there is one clue that refuses to go away. The wall isn't just linear. In certain places, it curves, bends, doubles back, almost like it's circling something invisible. Some researchers believe the wall once enclosed sacred ground, either burial or cosmological, a way to create a threshold between one kind of space and another. But what kind of space would require that much effort to define, yet leave behind no artifacts to prove its purpose? There are those who say the wall was never meant to be found, that what it encloses isn't inside it, but beneath it, that it was part of a forgotten spiritual technology, one we no longer recognize because it didn't produce objects, it produced experiences. And when the experiences stopped, the wall was left behind like a dead battery. Either way, Fort Mountain stands, silent, unbothered, still holding a shape no one asked it to take. But just west of here, another shape rises from the land, not of stone this time, but earth. Older, bigger, more intentional, and it's clear someone wanted it to be seen from above. 5. Old Stone Fort Earthwork. There's a place in central Tennessee where two rivers meet and carve a peninsula into the earth like a wedge. On that peninsula sits a stone structure so quiet, so overlooked, it almost hides in plain sight. Locals call it Old Stone Fort, but the name is a problem, because whatever it is, it's not a fort and never was. The site consists of an enormous set of low stone and earthen walls forming an irregularly shaped enclosure about 50 acres in size. That's not a typo. 50 acres. It's surrounded on three sides by steep bluffs and roaring water. The Duck and Little Duck rivers crash together at the edge of the structure like a natural moat. There's only one real entrance, and it's aligned quite precisely to the summer solstice sunrise. So no, it's not a fort. It's something much older and much stranger. Archaeologists date the old stone fort to around 2,000 years ago, placing it in the Middle Woodland period. That's roughly the same era as the Hopewell culture in Ohio, and there are architectural similarities, mounds, enclosures, and ceremonial landscapes shaped not by utility, but by meaning. This wasn't a village. No dwellings have been found inside. No hearths, no palisades, just the quiet hum of geometry stretched across sacred space. The walls themselves are deceptive, made of stacked stone and earthen fill. They look crude up close, almost like the remnants of a collapsed farm fence. But viewed from above or traced along the path, a careful order begins to emerge. The eastern entrance is flanked by two massive mounds. When the sun rises during the summer solstice, it shines directly through the gateway and onto the inner grounds. That's not accident, that's astronomy. Some scholars suggest the entire site was designed as a ceremonial calendar. Others think it was a place of pilgrimage, a neutral meeting ground for dispersed woodland cultures. There are signs of gatherings here, fragments of exotic chert, ceremonial pottery, and tools not native to the region. But if people came here, they didn't stay long, and they didn't leave much behind. More than once, the site has been dismissed as incomplete, a project interrupted, but that assumes we understand what completion looked like. What if the point wasn't to build a place to use, but to build a place that meant something just by existing? And here's the tension. For something so spatially vast and structurally visible, Old Stone Fort offers very little in terms of narrative. It resists our usual storytelling instincts. It's a place that clearly mattered immensely to someone at some point, but we don't know their name or what they believed or why they chose this particular tongue of land to crown with stone. And yet the landscape still speaks. Walk the trail around the perimeter and the temperature shifts. The wind changes. The river sounds different on each side. It's as if the space itself was tuned to an experience. You don't visit Old Stone Fort, you pass through it, and something in you passes with it. There are older mounds in the region, taller ones, more famous ones, but none quite as aggressively silent. Old Stone Fort is a structure that stares back at you, not with grandeur, but with refusal, a blank face made of stone, unwilling to explain itself. But to the west, where the flatlands begin to sprawl, lies a site that doesn't just hint at ritual, it screams it. It's bigger, stranger, and aligned to events we still can't fully track. And it may have been one of the most complex ceremonial landscapes in the prehistoric Southeast. 6. Pinson Mounds. Pinson Mounds is not a place people stumble upon. It doesn't command a skyline or sit on a well-beaten tourist path. Instead, it hides behind pine woods and prairie grass in West Tennessee, an unexpected burst of prehistoric precision amid what looks, at first glance, like farmland gone slightly lumpy. But those lumps aren't natural. They're mounds, and not just any mounds. Over 30 of them arranged in a massive ceremonial complex that spans 400 acres, possibly more. Earthen pyramids, platform mounds, geometric embankments, and avenues that suggest a rigor most people don't associate with 2,000-year-old societies. This wasn't a village. There were no permanent homes. This was an event space, though event doesn't really do justice to what happened here. Pinson dates to the Middle Woodland period, around 1500 CE. It's one of the largest and most elaborate mound complexes in the southeastern United States. The tallest mound, Saul's Mound, stands over 70 feet high. That's as tall as a modern 7-story building made entirely of basket-carried earth. And here's the kicker, we still don't know why. Some archaeologists believe Pinson was used as a pilgrimage center. People from scattered communities across the Southeast may have traveled here for seasonal gatherings, ceremonies, or celestial observations. The alignments support that. Several mounds line up with solar events, equinoxes, solstices, and possibly even moonrises. But unlike later Mississippian sites, there's no evidence of political hierarchy, no palaces, no temples, just coordinated purpose. So who coordinated it? That's where things get weird. The site shows signs of intense activity for a relatively short time, maybe a few centuries. Then, nothing. It was abandoned, not destroyed, not replaced, just left, as if the purpose had been fulfilled or the invitation rescinded. There's also the enigma of the mound types. Some are platforms, others are conical, a few are linear, serving no apparent architectural function. The layout feels both planned and improvised, as if built from multiple overlapping instructions. Some experts believe different regional groups contributed, each adding to the design with their own traditions. That would make Pinson less a city and more a conversation, an architectural dialogue across generations. Even the burials don't behave. Only a few mounds contain human remains, and those that do often have elaborate offerings, copper, mica, exotic shells, items that traveled hundreds of miles to get here. But the people themselves, they were laid to rest with extreme care and then left in peace. No signs of mass graves or conquest, just ritual and retreat. One of the biggest unsolved questions is why the people of Pinson went to such lengths to build this place and then walked away. Did their calendar change? Did their gods? Or did they leave for the same reason we leave churches and stadiums? Because the ritual ended and nothing else was supposed to happen there. Today the site is quiet. A state park preserves it, and signage tries to explain what little we know. But when you stand on top of Saul's Mound and look across the complex, the sense is unmistakable. Something happened here, and no one alive remembers what. But a few decades later, and just a few miles east, something else was unearthed. Something small, inscribed, and wildly controversial. Not a mound, a stone. One that might rewrite history or might be one of the cleverest archaeological hoaxes ever committed. 7. Bat Creek Stone. Sometimes a mystery doesn't start with the ancient world. It starts with a 19th century shovel and a very confident man named John W. Emmert. In 1889, Emmert was working for the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology. His task was to excavate burial mounds in Loudoun County, Tennessee, near the edge of the Appalachian Plateau. In one of the mounds, labeled Mound 3, Emmert unearthed a burial accompanied by a small engraved stone. It was curved, smoothed, and had a row of symbols carefully etched into its surface. He cataloged it, sent it to the Smithsonian, and they filed it away with a simple label, Indian Stone with Cherokee Characters. It sat mostly ignored for 70 years. Then in 1970, a scholar named Cyrus Gordon flipped the script and the stone, literally. He turned the artifact upside down and declared that the characters weren't Cherokee at all. They were Paleo-Hebrew. His interpretation, the inscription read for the Jews, or for Judea, which would mean a group of Semitic people somehow crossed the Atlantic over 1,000 years ago and left behind a grave marker in Appalachian, Tennessee. Cue the controversy. If true, the Bat Creek Stone would completely upend mainstream timelines of contact between the Old World and the Americas. It would suggest that not only were there pre-Columbian transatlantic voyages, but that those voyagers had cultural or religious missions in the ancient Southeast. Theories exploded, everything from Phoenicians to the lost tribes of Israel. Suddenly, an unassuming stone from a mound in East Tennessee was being name-dropped in the same breath as the Kensington Runestone and the Newark Holy Stones. Not the company you want to keep if you're aiming for academic consensus. The Smithsonian, caught off guard by its own artifact, conducted a reevaluation. Experts in epigraphy, archaeology, and ancient languages were brought in. The consensus was less than thrilling. The inscription was almost certainly a modern forgery. Critics pointed out that the Paleo-Hebrew characters matched precisely with examples found in 19th century textbooks, books available to anyone in Emmert's time. The line spacing was too even, the cuts too sharp. It looked more like a forgery inspired by a biblical imagination than an authentic cross-cultural relic. But the controversy didn't die, and here's why. First, the stone was found in a legitimate archaeological context. It wasn't just dropped in a field. It came from a controlled excavation documented under the banner of the Smithsonian, recovered alongside other woodland period artifacts. That's not something you dismiss lightly. Second, Emmert, for all his failings, never claimed the stone was special. He didn't shout from the rooftops. He described it plainly. No big claims, no fame seeking. If it was a hoax, it was a quiet one. And third, a small but persistent group of researchers argue that the entire skepticism around the Bat Creek stone reflects an institutional fear of rewriting American prehistory. In other words, it's not that the stone can't be real, it's that we don't want it to be. So now the Bat Creek stone sits behind glass at the McClung Museum of Natural History and Culture in Knoxville. It's presented as controversial, which is the museum world's way of saying, don't ask us, we're not picking a side. But here's the haunting part. The mound where the stone was found is long gone. It was destroyed during dam construction in the mid-20th century. No chance for re-excavation, no second opinions. All that's left is the stone, the notes, and the arguments. And in the absence of context, mystery takes root. But just downriver, carved into cliffs that catch the morning light, another set of symbols rises, not etched into a hand-sized tablet, but towering above the river, painted in layers and just as unyielding. 8. Painted Bluff petroglyphs. If the Bat Creek stone is a whisper, the Painted Bluff petroglyphs are a shout, though it's unclear who was meant to hear them. Located on a sandstone cliff face along the Tennessee River in northern Alabama, Painted Bluff rises nearly 100 feet above the water, forming a massive vertical canvas. And on that canvas are dozens, perhaps hundreds of ancient images, concentric circles, animal shapes, humanoid figures, and patterns so abstract they feel like codes. Painted in red ochre, the symbols layer over each other, intersect, and fade in and out depending on the light. This is not a site you stumble into. Accessing it requires a boat, careful timing with water levels, and a willingness to crane your neck uncomfortably for long periods. But the effort is worth it, because Painted Bluff is one of the most complex and least understood rock art sites in the Southeast. The cliff art likely dates between 1,000 and 3,000 years ago, and while it's been attributed to ancestors of the Mississippian or woodland cultures, that's about as specific as things get. There are no accompanying village remains, no nearby mounds, no cache of tools, just the paintings, suspended over the river like a warning, or a prayer, or a story told in a language no one speaks anymore. Researchers have identified certain themes: sun symbols, animal spirits, and what appear to be shamanic figures mid-transformation, part human, part bird, part something else, but other images resist classification entirely. One segment contains a grid-like field of lines that might represent counting, calendrical cycles, or ritual instructions. Another features a figure with a rectangular body and spirals for eyes, like a fever dream recorded in stone. And here's what makes Painted Bluff especially maddening: the superimposition. Many images were painted directly over earlier ones, not to replace them, but to layer them. It's as if the meaning of the site evolved over time, with each generation adding a new verse to a song only they knew how to sing. The result is a visual palimpsest, something meant to be read not just spatially, but temporally. But for what purpose? Some scholars suggest the bluff functioned as a ritual site tied to river journeys. Perhaps it marked a liminal space, a transition between one sacred zone and another. Others argue it was an observatory of sorts, with figures aligned to solar events or seasonal floods. Still others see it as a communal storytelling wall, where myths and histories were rendered symbolically for those who could read the syntax of pigment and stone. And of course, there are those who claim it's all shamanic, a visual map of spirit journeys meant to be seen during altered states of consciousness, which sounds poetic until you realize that no one can agree on what those journeys were. Today, the site is monitored and protected, but its future is far from guaranteed. Natural erosion is constant. Water levels fluctuate. Vandalism, though rare, is always a threat. In recent years, digital mapping has helped preserve the images virtually, but a scan isn't the same as a shadow cast at dusk or the way pigment glows in the late afternoon sun. These images weren't meant to live on screens. They were meant to live in place, and that place is still humming because Painted Bluff is part of a larger corridor and a riverine gallery of rock art that stretches across the southeast. And further down the line, at the edge of Mississippi, 8 mysterious mounds rise from the earth, arranged in silence, holding the bodies of the dead and the secrets of those who sent them off. 9. Pharr Mounds. You don't accidentally end up at Pharr Mounds. You make a plan, drive a stretch of the Natchez Trace Parkway through northeastern Mississippi, and find yourself in a broad, rolling field dotted with smooth, symmetrical rises in the earth. From the highway, they could be mistaken for natural hills. From above, they form a deliberate constellation, 8 earthen mounds arranged across 90 acres, each one constructed by hand, basket load by basket load, nearly 2,000 years ago. This was a burial site. That much is certain. Excavations in the 1960s revealed log-lined tombs, cremations, and the carefully curated presence of grave goods, copper pan pipes, marine shell cups, mica mirrors, projectile points, and beads made of stone and bone. Most of the objects were not local. They came from far away, Florida, the Great Lakes, the Ohio River Valley, suggesting Pharr Mounds was more than just a resting place. It was a node in a much larger network, and yet for all its geographic significance, almost nothing is known about the people who built it. Scholars attribute the site to Middle Woodland cultures, connected loosely to the Hopewell interaction sphere, but that term, interaction sphere, feels clinical, like trying to define a religion by its trade routes. What happened here wasn't just economic, it was cosmological. The arrangement of the mounds seems intentional. Several are paired, others align with distant landmarks or each other in ways that hint at calendrical planning, but unlike more famous sites such as Cahokia or Newark, Pharr Mounds lacks monumental architecture, no central plaza, no towering effigies, no walls, just earth, raised, shaped, and settled. If this was a ceremonial center, it was a quiet one. There's no evidence of long-term habitation, no signs of houses or large-scale gatherings. Whatever rituals took place here were periodic, purposeful, and private, the kind of sacred that doesn't require an audience. And that's what makes it unnerving, because while most modern cemeteries try to comfort the living, these mounds don't offer comfort. They offer presence. Their proportions are too precise, their placement too silent. Stand near Mound E on a windless day, and the air itself feels heavy, not ominous, just aware. One of the most enduring questions is the order of construction. Were the mounds built all at once as part of a master plan, or were they added sequentially, each one marking a generation's passing? Excavations hint at layered use, with some mounds rebuilt or reused after initial burials, but the overall spatial coherence remains, like variations on a theme composed by people who never wrote anything down. And then there's the issue of legacy. After the Middle Woodland period, the site appears to have been abandoned. Later indigenous groups knew of the mounds but didn't reuse them. They respected them, avoided them, as if the ground itself had been closed off. Today, Pharr Mounds is a National Park Service site. The mounds are maintained, the paths trimmed, and the signage helpful, but none of that solves the mystery. If anything, the tidy landscaping only emphasizes the void at the center. We know how the mounds were made. We don't know why. But just over the Appalachian Divide, in western North Carolina, another cluster of earthworks hints at the same unanswered questions, this time with geometric precision, concentric enclosures, and a riddle that ties the Carolinas to Ohio in ways we still haven't mapped. 10. Garden Creek enclosures and mounds. Tucked into the rolling pastures of Haywood County, North Carolina, the Garden Creek archaeological site is easy to miss, especially now that the fields have been returned to farmland and the structures that once dominated the landscape lie hidden beneath soil and memory. But 2,000 years ago, this quiet stretch of land was a focal point of ritual architecture, an Appalachian outpost intricately connected to mound-building traditions hundreds of miles away. The site, first formally excavated in the 1960s and again in the early 2010s, revealed an unusual complexity. There were mounds, yes, 3 of them, built in distinct phases. But even more curious were the enclosures, geometric shapes outlined in earth with deep post holes suggesting palisades or ceremonial walls. One of the enclosures, a massive oval over 200 feet wide, was defined by paired posts like the ribs of a wooden cathedral long since vanished. This is not typical for southern Appalachian prehistory. These kinds of enclosures, especially in this scale and form, are rare in North Carolina, but common in the Ohio River Valley, particularly at Hopewell sites like Newark and Chillicothe, which raises the question, what was Ohio doing in western North Carolina? Artifacts provide a clue. Burials beneath the mounds included copper, marine shell, and mica, materials traded from distant regions. The presence of platform pipes, intricately carved and ritually broken, mirrors practices seen in Hopewell contexts. This wasn't casual influence, it was participation, and yet the Garden Creek builders were not simply copying Ohio traditions. They were local people, adapting distant ideas. The mounds here are smaller, the enclosures more intimate. It's as if the forms of Hopewell were reinterpreted to suit different needs, a local dialect of a ceremonial language. One theory suggests the site was a seasonal gathering place, a midpoint between mountain communities and lowland trade routes. Another sees it as a kind of spiritual embassy, a southern extension of the Hopewell world. But none of these explanations fully account for the precision of the layout or the care with which certain structures were buried and rebuilt. In one instance, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a charnel structure, a sacred building used for mortuary rituals that had been carefully burned and then covered with soil. The mound that rose above it wasn't an afterthought. It was a closing statement, a punctuation mark in earth. Despite its significance, Garden Creek is largely unknown outside archaeological circles. There are no interpretive signs, no reconstructed mounds. The site today is mostly pasture, interrupted only by the occasional excavation scar or subsurface anomaly. Its power lies in what isn't visible, but the absence only adds weight. Garden Creek was a place where time layered itself in circles, where geometry met grief, and where cultural identity was both asserted and adapted. We don't know what the ceremonies looked like. We don't know what stories were told inside the wooden walls, but we know they meant something worth burying and rebuilding and remembering. And while Garden Creek speaks in patterns, the next mystery speaks in disappearances, a whole culture that blinked out of existence just before written history arrived, a vanishing act still unfolding in the borderlands of Pennsylvania and West Virginia. 11. Monongahela culture's disappearance. They vanished, but not with fire. There were no known wars, no smoking ruins, no mass graves, and yet sometime around the 1630s, the Monongahela people, builders of stockaded villages across western Pennsylvania, northern West Virginia, and parts of Ohio, simply disappeared from the archaeological record. Dozens of villages, hundreds of structures, thousands of individuals gone. No migration trail, no adoption into nearby tribes that we can trace. Just silence. This wasn't an obscure band of nomads. The Monongahela culture had flourished for over 400 years. They lived in circular villages arranged around central plazas. Their homes were semi-subterranean, efficient in winter. They cultivated maize and other crops, hunted game, and traded up and down the river systems. Their pottery was distinctive, cord-marked and grit-tempered, often decorated with complex rim patterns. Their society was stable, their settlements permanent, their footprint unmistakable, and then sometime between 1620 and 1640, it all stopped. Theories abound. One popular idea is that disease, possibly introduced by European trade routes even before direct contact, swept through the region. Smallpox, measles, influenza, none of these would have required an actual European visitor to spread. All it would have taken was one trade item, a contaminated blanket, a metal tool, a bead. The timing fits, but while epidemics can decimate, they rarely erase. Cultures tend to adapt, splinter, merge. The Monongahela left no such aftermath. Another hypothesis points to climate. The early 1600s marked the peak of the Little Ice Age, a period of colder temperatures and unpredictable seasons. Crop yields may have failed. Game may have thinned. Conflict over resources may have risen. Yet again, collapse doesn't usually look like disappearance. It looks like movement, dispersion, struggle. Instead, we find abandoned villages, perfectly intact post molds, fire pits filled with the last meal cooked, then nothing. Some suggest warfare. Iroquois expansion during the Beaver Wars was aggressive and far-reaching, especially in the decades following European contact. But the Monongahela weren't clearly in the path of that expansion until later, and there's little direct evidence. No battle debris, no burned settlements. If there was conflict, it wasn't the kind that left arrows behind. And here's where things turn speculative. Some archaeologists have noticed that Monongahela villages grew increasingly fortified over time. Earlier sites had simple wooden palisades. Later ones had multiple rings of defense. Some show signs of hasty construction, as if the builders anticipated an attack from an enemy they couldn't quite name. But from whom and why so thoroughly? One fringe theory suggests internal collapse, ideological schism perhaps, or a breakdown in the social contract. A religion turned against itself, a spiritual withdrawal from the land. But there's no smoking gun for this, just the eerie symmetry of a pattern that ends too cleanly. Today, the Monongahela legacy is a scatter of pottery shards, village post holes, and cautionary footnotes in archaeology journals. Their name, derived from the Monongahela River, is not what they called themselves. We don't know that name. We may never know it. What we do know is that their absence is so complete, it feels deliberate, as if, rather than perish, they chose to vanish, not into death, but into forgetting. But just west of their former territory lies a cave, not the burial kind, not the habitation kind, a rock shelter stacked with sediment and time, where human presence stretches back not centuries, but millennia, and its dates don't just challenge history, they offend it. 12. Meadowcroft Rockshelter. At first glance, Meadowcroft Rockshelter looks like a glorified overhang, an elevated crease in a southwestern Pennsylvania hillside overlooking Cross Creek. You could pass it on a hike and never guess it holds one of the oldest records of human presence in North America. It's not a monument, it's not even a mound, it's a modest sandstone alcove, about 46 feet wide and 16 feet deep. But inside its layers of sediment lies a quiet provocation, radiocarbon dates suggesting human activity as early as 19,000 years ago, thousands of years before the Clovis culture, long held as the earliest definitive human presence on the continent. Discovered in the 1950s and excavated through the 1970s by archaeologist James Adovazio, Meadowcroft became a lightning rod almost immediately. The problem wasn't the excavation, it was the implication. If people were living in this rock shelter 16,000 to 19,000 years ago, then the widely accepted model of the Bering Land Bridge migration, occurring around 13,000 years ago, needed a rewrite. The skepticism was fierce. Critics questioned the dating methods, the stratigraphy, even the interpretation of the artifacts. Some suggested the ancient charcoal samples had been contaminated by older coal deposits in the region. Others claimed the tools, bladelets, scrapers, and small bifaces were misidentified or intrusive, but as the years went on, more evidence stacked up. Not just from Meadowcroft, but from other sites, Monte Verde in Chile, Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, Cactus Hill in Virginia, all suggesting pre-Clovis habitation. Meadowcroft didn't look like an outlier anymore. It looked like a keystone. The site itself is a masterclass in stratigraphy. Over 11 feet of sediment layers contain evidence of 19 distinct periods of human occupation, spanning from 19,000 years ago to historic times. Artifacts recovered include not only stone tools, but also animal bones, plant remains, and fire-cracked rocks. The presence of prickly pear seeds in some layers even hints at the seasonal diet of the inhabitants, and yet, for all its precision, Meadowcroft remains an enigma. Who were these people? Where did they come from? How did they survive in a Pleistocene environment? There are no skeletal remains, no cave paintings, no sacred texts scratched into the walls, just the unmistakable residue of life, cooking fires, broken tools, discarded seeds. Some believe the early occupants arrived by a coastal route following the Pacific shoreline from Asia. Others propose multiple waves of migration, perhaps even predating the last ice age, but the theories are still outpacing the data. Today, Meadowcroft is preserved as a museum and historical site. A massive shelter structure now hovers above the original cave like a futuristic canopy, protecting it from weather and the slow decay of time. Visitors can walk through the excavation levels on elevated platforms, peering down into the layers like geologists peering through time. But the site still feels haunted, not by ghosts, but by the tension of its implications. If people were here 19,000 years ago, then everything we thought we knew about the peopling of the Americas, who arrived, when, and how, needs a serious update. And so Meadowcroft sits, not as a monument to certainty, but as a challenge, a dare, a reminder that even the most unassuming rock shelter can carry the weight of an entire continent's origin myth. Further downriver, though, a different kind of rock holds a different kind of mystery, not prehistoric, but just old enough to confuse everyone. A single boulder in the water, carved with strange figures, including archers, and carrying a name that suggests divinity. 13. Indian God Rock. It's easy to miss, tucked along a bend in the Allegheny River in northwestern Pennsylvania, resting halfway between obscurity and worship. Indian God Rock isn't towering or grand. It's a sandstone boulder, roughly the size of a car, perched on the riverbank like a leftover thought from a culture no longer present. Yet carved into its surface are figures that don't just suggest meaning, they demand it. Dozens of petroglyphs cover the rock, abstract shapes, spirals, animal forms, and most famously, what appear to be human figures wielding bows. Archers, which is unusual, very unusual. Petroglyphs in the Ohio River Valley and surrounding regions often feature animal tracks, handprints, celestial forms, and sometimes humans, but a human with a bow is a rare motif, especially one as clearly stylized as this. The archer has been interpreted as a hunter, a warrior, a deity, or even a cosmological figure firing arrows into the sky. He stands poised in a stance that feels deliberate, like he's mid-action or mid-myth. The rock first entered the documented record in the 18th century when European settlers encountered it and assigned it a name soaked in colonial projection, Indian God Rock. The name stuck. Over time, it gathered reputations, sacred place, tribal marker, spiritual waypoint, but no definitive story. Even tribal oral histories are cautious, acknowledging the boulder's significance without claiming to fully decode it. That's not surprising. The Allegheny was a travel corridor for thousands of years, a riverine highway through which ideas, goods, and people moved. The rock's carvings likely accumulated over time, made by different groups with different intentions. Some images may date back 1,000 years or more. Others could be much more recent. There are even 19th century graffiti scrawled on top, a layered insult to the silence beneath. Archaeologists have attempted to catalog and categorize the symbols, but the context is missing. No adjacent village site, no shrine, no buried offerings, just a rock facing the water, like a sentinel whose purpose was never meant to be archived. Weathering has further complicated things. Over centuries, floods, ice, and careless visitors have worn away some of the most important details. Even the famous archer is fading. Today, you have to stand just right in the light or catch the shadows at sunset to make out his form. It's a vanishing message, eroded not just by nature, but by time's indifference to clarity. Still, the archer holds attention. Some see him as Orion, the hunter from global myth, transposed into a local legend. Others suggest he represents a cultural hero, a figure from regional folklore, whose name has been lost, but whose stance remains. A few interpret the whole tableau as a celestial map, the bowmen aligning with star patterns or seasonal markers, but those are guesses. The truth is quieter. The truth is that Indian god rock speaks a language we no longer hear, not because it's mystical, but because it wasn't preserved, it wasn't transcribed, it wasn't considered ours, so it was left to fade. Today, the rock is protected by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, but protection is a generous word. It's accessible to the public, vulnerable to vandalism and erosion, and slowly being swallowed by its environment, a legend that's slowly being erased, not by a lack of importance, but by the slow, grinding silence of neglect. But Indian God Rock is not alone. Just a few miles south, further down the Susquehanna system, are two sibling stones, equally mysterious, bigger, more elaborate, and just as unreadable, twin monuments to a message that was never meant to stand alone. 14. Big Indian Rock. It's not the kind of monument that announces itself. Big Indian Rock lies in the Susquehanna River like a thought someone forgot to finish. Massive, quiet, barely visible from the shore unless you know precisely where to look. When the river runs low, it reveals itself. A broad, flat expanse of sandstone, darkened with water stains and etched with something older than memory. And what's etched there isn't random. Dozens of petroglyphs, some deeply carved, others worn to near erasure, cover the rock's surface in a pattern that is almost legible, almost readable, almost a language. There are human figures, handprints, footprints, concentric circles, spirals, animal forms, solar emblems, and abstract designs that resist classification. At least 50 carvings have been documented, and most experts agree this was a site of significance, not a doodle pad. The rock lies near Safe Harbor Dam in southern Pennsylvania. Its name, Big Indian Rock, is a colonial holdover, one of those vague labels that imply native presence without acknowledging native authorship. The carvings are attributed to indigenous peoples, likely the ancestors of the Susquehannock or their cultural predecessors who lived along the Susquehanna River for generations. But here's the problem. We don't know exactly who carved them or when. That's not just academic sloppiness. Petroglyphs are notoriously difficult to date. There's no carbon to radiocarbon, no stratigraphy, just the depth of the cut, the style of the image, and comparisons to similar sites elsewhere. Some of the carvings may be 500 years old, others could be closer to 1,000. Still others may be more recent. The river, meanwhile, keeps no records. Theories about the purpose of the carvings multiply, as they always do. One school of thought argues that the glyphs served a territorial function, marking this stretch of river as sacred, significant, or claimed. Another suggests the site was used for rituals, possibly related to hunting or spirit invocation. The presence of both human and animal forms hints at shamanic cosmology, where the boundaries between the two dissolve. There are carvings that resemble fish, turtles, birds. One appears to be a large bird in flight, its wings splayed wide, etched with a level of care that implies reverence or memory. A few of the designs have clear solar motifs, concentric circles with rays, almost like spoked wheels. Could they mark solstices, celestial events, or are they something more abstract? Representations of spirit journeys, soul maps, or visions? Of all the symbols, the footprints and handprints strike the hardest. They're intimate, immediate, as if someone was trying to say, I was here, I touched this, I walked this stone. It's not just art, it's presence. Modern attempts to read the rock have largely failed. The images don't arrange themselves into a story, at least not one that fits within Western narrative. Logic, there's no beginning, no middle, no clear resolution, just forms, repeating, overlapping, layered over centuries of water and time. Some of the glyphs were defaced in the 19th and early 20th centuries, names carved over ancient figures, initials scarring the surface. What's left has been documented by archaeologists and preservationists, but the damage is permanent. The stories that were once here have been scrambled, and maybe that's fitting. We treated the rock like a curiosity, and it treated us like a temporary problem. Today, Big Indian Rock is only accessible by boat. There's no museum, no marked trail, no visitor center kiosk, just the river, the stone, and the carvings, and the sense that something sacred still lingers, not because we remember what it was, but because we don't. But Big Indian Rock isn't the end of the sentence. Just downstream, its sibling waits, smaller, closer to the water, and somehow denser with symbolism. Little Indian Rock, its companion and contrast, is carved just as deeply into the river's myth, and it offers just as few answers. 15. Little Indian Rock, a few paddle strokes downstream from Big Indian Rock. Its quieter, less expansive sibling emerges from the Susquehanna's current, Little Indian Rock. It's not as wide, not as broad, but in terms of density, in terms of sheer symbolic saturation, Little Indian Rock more than holds its own. If Big Indian Rock is a ceremonial plaza, then Little Indian Rock is the altar, compact, deliberate, and packed with a kind of encrypted significance that still baffles every attempt to decode it. The petroglyphs here are tighter, deeper, and more stylized than on its neighboring boulder. Some are similar in theme: human figures, footprints, animal shapes, spirals, and abstract patterns, but there's something sharper about them, more intentional. Where Big Indian Rock's carvings sometimes feel layered and overlapping, like an ongoing mural added to over generations, the symbols on Little Indian Rock feel like they were carved during a single breath. That's not to say they were. It's entirely possible that the carvings span generations too, but the impression is different. There's cohesion, a sense of layout, a choice perhaps to carve smaller but speak louder. One of the most famous motifs on Little Indian Rock is a set of concentric circles radiating like ripples or suns. These are often interpreted as solar symbols, celestial calendars, or spiritual eyes. A few figures appear to hold spears or staffs, rendered with a kind of confident minimalism that suggests mythic or ritual significance. At least one figure has been interpreted by some scholars as a bird-human hybrid, a possible representation of a spirit being or a shapeshifter, figures well known in indigenous oral traditions throughout the eastern woodlands. The depth of the carvings also suggests something else: permanence. These weren't casual marks. Whoever carved them had the time, the tools, and the muscle to dig deeply into solid sandstone. This wasn't graffiti. It was an act of devotion, of communication, or perhaps a kind of spiritual engineering, symbols designed not just to be seen, but to do something. But to do what? That's the mystery. Some researchers believe the petroglyphs at both Big and Little Indian rocks may have functioned as part of a larger ritual landscape, places where river travelers stopped, paid respects, or performed rites as they moved between territories. The carvings could have marked seasonal changes, spiritual thresholds, or locations where the human and spirit worlds intersected. Others lean into cosmological explanations. The carvings might align with celestial events, or more abstractly, they may mirror the shape of the river itself, its bends, currents, and dangers. The Susquehanna was never just a waterway, it was a lifeline, a myth path, a corridor, not just for trade, but for story. Then there's the troubling possibility. Maybe these images weren't meant for us to understand. Not now, not ever. Maybe their power came from secrecy, that only those initiated into a specific lineage or cosmology could read them. And without that key, we're not archaeologists. We're eavesdroppers. Today, Little Indian Rock is just as vulnerable as its sibling. Erosion continues. Water levels rise and fall. Graffiti creeps in. Some of the carvings are now visible only under particular light or through 3D scanning. The deeper cuts survive. The finer details blur. But the overall impression remains. This was a place of deliberate memory, a site chosen for its visibility and its removal, in the middle of the river, on a rock that disappears and reappears with the season. Its presence through absence, meaning through mystery. And it's not alone. Further upriver and tucked into a tributary bend, another set of petroglyphs once drew scholars, tourists, and curiosity seekers. It's mostly forgotten now, but for a time, Walnut Island was one of the most talked about carved stones in the Susquehanna Valley, and just as ambiguous in meaning. 16. Walnut Island petroglyphs. It takes effort to even find a reference to them today. The Walnut Island petroglyphs once sat proudly on display, carefully photographed, interpreted, and debated. Now they live mostly in archives and fading memory. The island itself is nearly gone, shaped by damming, floods, and shifting currents. But the petroglyphs, they still exist if you know where to look. Located originally on a low island in the Susquehanna River near Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, the Walnut Island carvings formed part of a cluster of river-based rock art in the region, alongside Big and Little Indian rocks, the Bald Friar stones, and several other lesser-known sites. The exact number of carvings at Walnut Island varied depending on which 19th century surveyor you asked, but estimates range from a few dozen to over 100 discrete figures. These weren't random scratches. The petroglyphs were carved with deliberate strokes, often deeply etched, and arranged in patterns that seemed to communicate, though what they communicated is still up for debate. The imagery is familiar, but frustratingly vague. You'll find animal tracks, deer, bear, turkey, footprints, spirals, radiating circles, occasionally humanoid figures. Some believe these symbols form a kind of symbolic vocabulary used by multiple regional groups. Others see them as personal markings left by travelers, hunters, or shamans to record a vision, an offering, and a warning. One of the most intriguing interpretations is that the carvings were a map, not of physical territory, but of myth, a cartography of storylines and sacred geography passed down through memory and engraved in stone as a way to remind future generations where power once flowed. In that reading, Walnut Island wasn't a settlement or shrine. It was a mythological signpost, a narrative crossroads meant to guide people not through space, but through meaning. Sadly, the site's deterioration began long ago. The construction of river dams and changing water levels submerged much of Walnut Island during parts of the year. In the early 20th century, Attempts were made to document and preserve some of the carvings, photographs, rubbings, drawings. A few stones were even relocated, but the context was lost. The site itself became fractured. And like so many things removed from place, the carvings lost part of their voice. That hasn't stopped people from trying to translate them. Some local historians connect the Walnut Island figures to ancient fertility rituals. Others claim alignments with solstices or equinoxes. A few more imaginative thinkers propose that the site was a language bridge, a place where different tribes used shared iconography to communicate across linguistic divides. There's no consensus, only the familiar frustration of trying to assemble meaning from symbols when the dictionary has been burned. Today, Walnut Island doesn't draw tourists. Most Pennsylvanians haven't even heard of it, but the mystery remains. What compelled people to carve stone in the middle of a river? What memory or message was so important that it had to be inscribed where the current runs hardest? And perhaps more importantly, what else lies submerged? Carvings will never see, stones will never raise, meanings will never recover. A few miles upriver, another carving waits, not on an island this time, but a bluff above the river, almost forgotten, but just visible enough to remind us that the Susquehanna keeps its secrets in series. 17. Creswell Rock Petroglyphs. The Susquehanna River is a ribbon of riddles, and tucked along its many curves is yet another one, smaller, quieter, and barely whispered about outside Pennsylvania archaeology circles. Creswell Rock, named for the nearby community in Lancaster County, is one of the lesser-known petroglyph sites in the region. It lacks the grandeur of Big Indian Rock, the spiritual saturation of Walnut Island, or the scholarly attention of Bald Friar, but what it offers is perhaps even more unsettling: precision without explanation. Carved into a river-worn sandstone outcrop, the petroglyphs at Creswell Rock are etched with a kind of methodical restraint. No chaotic layering, no overcarving, just a sparse arrangement of symbols that suggest purpose but not story. There are the usual suspects: footprints, animal tracks, spiral motifs, but also less common forms: tightly nested concentric circles, geometric grids, and odd rectangular shapes that feel schematic, almost architectural. Unlike the more densely carved sites nearby, Creswell's spacing feels intentional, as if the blank space between symbols was just as important as the symbols themselves, as if someone was writing in a language that required silence between each word. We don't know who carved them. Based on stylistic parallels and regional context, the petroglyphs are attributed broadly to late woodland or early contact period indigenous peoples, perhaps ancestors of the Susquehannock or other riverine cultures, but no single group claims authorship in surviving oral traditions, and no settlement remains have been found nearby. This wasn't a village, it wasn't a shrine, it may have been a waypoint, spiritual, symbolic, or mnemonic. Some researchers suggest the site was used as a river marker, a kind of navigational glyph. Others interpret the geometric forms as calendrical or astronomical, early attempts to encode seasonal patterns into stone. But again, interpretation stumbles. There's not enough data to draw clear conclusions, and that ambiguity, paired with the deliberate restraint of the carvings, makes Creswell Rock one of the more haunting entries in the Susquehanna's hidden lexicon. One petroglyph in particular draws attention: a large square enclosing a cross, surrounded by faint dashes. Some have called it a cosmic window, others a map, still others a kind of proto-symbol for a long-lost spiritual system. Whatever its function, it sits alone, like a punctuation mark without a sentence. Today, the site is unmarked and unpublicized, rarely visited except by the most dedicated researchers or river enthusiasts. The carvings are slowly fading under the effects of time, erosion, and seasonal flooding. There are no fences, no interpretive signs, no drone flyovers, just stone, water, and absence. But that absence has its own gravity, because if Creswell Rock proves anything, It's that not every sacred site needs to be monumental. Some speak in whispers, in glyphs, spaced too far apart for comfort. And maybe that's the point. Mystery isn't always layered, it's sometimes built on restraint. A few counties to the west, another carved rock lies half forgotten, tucked into the shadow of a Pennsylvania hillside, not as public, not as studied, but still etched with the unmistakable imprint of intent. And mystery doesn't soften just because it's in a field. 18. Francis Farm Petroglyphs. There's no sign pointing the way to the Francis Farm Petroglyphs, no guidebooks, no brochures in the local visitor center. In fact, unless you're a specialist or grew up within shouting distance of Fayette County, you probably haven't heard of them at all. But that's exactly what makes this site so enduringly strange. It exists in the quiet margins of history, marked by symbols no one has confidently deciphered, preserved not by planning, but by neglect. Located on private farmland, the petroglyphs were first documented in the mid-20th century by regional researchers. They occupy a relatively small area of exposed rock on a hillside slope, now partially overgrown, often inaccessible, and rarely visited, but the carvings themselves, still there, still sharp enough to provoke questions. They consist of about 30 to 40 individual glyphs, though the number varies depending on whether you count the partials, the faint ones, and the overlapping lines that may or may not be deliberate. The imagery here is a familiar mix for the region: abstract spirals, cross and circles, animal tracks, handprints, and stylized figures that hover somewhere between human and spirit. There's also a handful of symbols that appear nowhere else in the Susquehanna Valley corpus: a jagged Y-shaped figure with radiating lines and a curious zigzag enclosed in an oval. As always, interpretations range from the cautious to the cosmically ambitious. Some archaeologists believe the petroglyphs were carved during the late woodland period, between 800 and 1600 CE. Their function? Possibly ceremonial, possibly mnemonic, possibly territorial. Some local researchers suggest they were used in initiation rites or seasonal observances, ways to mark transitions, both ecological and spiritual. The orientation of the carvings seems to favor the western horizon, leading some to speculate that sunset alignments played a role in their meaning. But again, speculation is all we have. No associated habitation site has been confirmed nearby. No oral tradition names the site directly. No portable artifacts have been found. The rock is just there, carved, weathered, stubborn. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't have to. And perhaps that's the lesson of Frantish Farm. Not every sacred space broadcasts its significance. Some are local, intimate, designed for a specific group, in a specific moment, with no interest in longevity. The symbols aren't meant for us. They were never meant for outsiders. They were carved for people who already knew. Today, access is limited. The site is privately owned, and while preservation efforts have been discussed, no formal protections exist. Some of the glyphs are fading, others are intact, but as is so often the case in the Appalachian backwoods, the absence of attention has functioned as a kind of shield, and the silence only deepens, because just across the state line along another stretch of the river, a different set of petroglyphs was rescued from rising waters, moved stone by stone, image by image, but in saving them, we may have erased the very thing that gave them meaning. 19. Bald Friar Petroglyphs. Imagine a river so powerful it threatens to swallow memory whole. That was the dilemma in the early 20th century when plans for the Conowingo Dam along the lower Susquehanna River meant that a set of ancient carvings etched into boulders perched just above the waterline were about to be submerged forever. The carvings, known as the Bald Friar Petroglyphs, were already something of a local legend. Strange figures carved into rocks, visible only when the river ran low. They were mysterious, beautiful, and like so many things in this landscape, utterly unexplained. So in 1926, a decision was made: move them stone by stone, petroglyph by petroglyph. A team of engineers and historians carefully cut out the carvings and relocated them to the Maryland Academy of Sciences. Later, they were moved again to Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, where they rest today, labeled, cataloged, and safely removed from the erosion that once threatened them. But something was lost in the rescue: context, orientation, place. The carvings had lived on the river for over 1,000 years. They weren't just images, they were positions in a larger pattern, a cosmological map whose meanings may have depended on light, water level, season, even the sound of the current. By saving the symbols, we may have severed their purpose. What we know is this: the bald friar carvings were part of the same symbolic tradition found upstream on Big Indian Rock, Walnut Island, and others, but they were distinct. They featured deeply pecked circles, concentric designs, claw-like marks, and cross and circle motifs, interpreted by some as solar, by others as ritual boundaries. There were abstract humanoid shapes and birds, possibly thunderbirds, etched with a kind of symmetrical order that suggested they weren't just art, they were function. Some scholars believe the site marked a spiritual boundary, the crossing point between river regions or between different clans. Others see it as a ceremonial platform used in seasonal rites or rites of passage. Still others think it may have been a sacred fishing site where spirits were petitioned for luck, safety, or sustenance. One of the most persistent theories is that the Bald Friar site was aligned with the sun. The shapes on some stones resemble solar wheels, and when in their original setting, certain glyphs may have faced solstice, sunrise, or sunset points, but because they were moved, rotated, and displayed out of sequence, we can only guess. And here lies the irony: in saving the carvings, we may have erased the meaning. What was once a site embedded in its environment, resonating with river, sky, and time, is now an exhibit. The symbols survived. The system they belonged to did not. Still, the carvings whisper. They resist total silence, because even in isolation, they carry the weight of intention. Someone knelt at those stones, tools in hand, and carved meaning into the world, meaning we no longer share, but still feel faintly. And the Susquehanna doesn't give up its secrets easily. Just west, tucked into a lesser-known tributary in West Virginia, another site hides under moss and shadow, a rock panel carved with figures not just abstract, but alive, anthropomorphs, beings, shapes that stare back. 20. Wildcat Branch, Indian Cave, petroglyphs in the wooded hills of West Virginia's Cabell County, where roads narrow into gravel and trees lean too close to the shoulder. There's a shallow sandstone overhang known to locals as Indian Cave. Officially, it's part of the Wildcat Branch petroglyph site, listed in National Register records and known in certain academic circles. But on the ground, it's something more intimate, more peculiar, and less explained. The site is modest in seats but rich in complexity. On the underside of the rock overhang are pecked and incised images, some weathered into near invisibility, others still sharp enough to trace with a finger. What sets these carvings apart isn't just their age or location, it's their presence. Many are anthropomorphic, that is, they resemble people, or something close to people. These aren't stick figures, they're stylized bodies, some with outstretched arms, others with elaborate headdresses or radiating lines around the head like halos or auras. Some seem to be dancing, others simply stand, their forms rigid and symmetrical, staring straight ahead, and one or two seem to be in transition, caught between human and animal, between form and abstraction. The rock itself is part of a shelter, a dry space tucked into a bend, overlooking a narrow ravine. It's not hard to imagine this space used for ceremonial purposes, vision quests, storytelling, or instruction. The acoustics are particular. Every sound made inside seems amplified, echoed, and directed outward. If ritual happened here, the space would have amplified its effect. The petroglyphs are believed to be from the late woodland period, likely between 1,000 and 500 years ago, but the cultural attribution is tricky. No known tribe has claimed authorship directly, and the figures don't match exactly with other regional traditions. The result is a site that feels connected to everything and nothing, a one-off, a local variation of a much broader spiritual language. Some researchers propose that the site was used for initiation rites and that the anthropomorphic figures represent spirit beings, entities encountered during altered states of consciousness. Others argue for storytelling, pictographic records of events, myths, or clan histories. Still others suggest the carvings are instructional, diagrams meant to guide or warn. And then there's the atmosphere. Visitors, those few who make the trek, often report a feeling of being watched, not ominously, not malevolently, just noticed. The figures on the wall don't fade into the background. They engage. You don't just look at them. They seem to respond. Today, the site is relatively protected, though access is still informal. There's no grand signage, no interpretive trail, just a rock panel, moss creeping in from the edges, and the sense that whatever was carved here wasn't meant for tourists. It was meant for participants. And while Indian Cave stares back, high on a ridge nearby lies something even more confusing, a long winding formation of stone, built not for art or vision, but possibly for orientation or separation or something much harder to name. 21. Mount Carbon Stone Walls. Tucked into the hills of Fayette County, West Virginia, near the small community of Mount Carbon, an ancient mystery stretches across the ridgelines, one that almost no one talks about, even though it's hiding in plain sight. Long stone walls, or what's left of them, trace their way through the forest like the remains of a forgotten language written in rock. No signage, no interpretive trail, and most frustratingly, no clear reason for existing. These are the Mount Carbon Stone Walls, and if they have a story, it's keeping itself quiet. First documented in the late 1800s by curious surveyors and local farmers, the stone walls appear to span multiple ridges, sometimes following the contour of the land, sometimes cutting across it with indifference. They're dry stacked, no mortar, no shaping, just rock upon rock, fitted with effort and endurance. Some segments stretch for hundreds of feet. Others peter out suddenly, as if whoever built them changed their mind halfway through. Are they ancient? Maybe. Are they colonial? Maybe. Are they a mixture of both? That's the real possibility that keeps researchers up at night. Mainstream archaeologists have offered the expected explanations. Early European settlers sometimes built similar walls to clear farmland or define property lines. Makes sense until you consider that many of these walls exist in places where no one would farm, not even the most desperate homesteader. Rocky ridges, steep terrain, no water sources, no arable land. And then there's the sheer labor involved. If they were just clearing fields, why carry the stones hundreds of feet along the ridge instead of piling them nearby? Some locals have long believed the walls predate colonization altogether. In the 19th century, local folklore linked them to the so-called mound builders, lumping them in with Adena or Hopewell era structures. Others, less cautiously, suggested the Moon-Eyed people built them, echoing Cherokee legends of a pre-existing group of pale, nocturnal inhabitants displaced by later arrivals. There's no evidence for that, but there's also nothing to fully rule it out. And that's where this site lives, in the murk. No carbon datable material has been retrieved directly from the walls, no associated artifacts, no clear pattern of habitation, just long, lonely stone lines that seem to serve no modern purpose and sit miles from any known indigenous village site. Some walls align vaguely with solstice lines or ridge-top sight lines, leading a few investigators to speculate about astronomical functions, maybe even ceremonial boundaries. Others think they could have marked spiritual thresholds or territorial edges. But again, no inscriptions, no offerings, no internal markers, just rock, heavy and silent. What makes Mount Carbon especially haunting is how little attention it gets. Unlike major mound sites or dramatic petroglyph panels, these walls don't attract headlines or hashtags. They fade into the forest. They look like nature until you walk their length, feel the weight of the stones, and realize you're tracing someone's intention. Someone who took the time to move heavy rock through unforgiving terrain for a purpose that may never be known. But travel north into Ohio and the stones start to speak again, carved not into lines, but into figures, pecked into a cliffside so clearly that even school children can recognize them, and yet their meanings remain every bit as elusive. 22. Leo Petroglyph. In a shaded grove outside the small town of Leo, Ohio, just east of Jackson, you'll find a sandstone outcrop that looks, at first glance, like any other exposed cliff in the Appalachian foothills. But lean in and something else emerges. Dozens of figures, stylized, strange, deeply carved, sprawl across the rock's surface like a prehistoric storyboard. This is the Leo Petroglyph, one of Ohio's most vivid and debated examples of ancient rock art. Here, the carvings aren't abstract spirals or isolated tracks. They are characters, humanoid figures with exaggerated limbs, outstretched arms, oversized hands, and curious head shapes. Some have what look like antennae. Others appear mid-motion, frozen in a dance, a hunt, or a ritual. Alongside them are animal forms, deer, birds, bear prints, and geometric patterns that resist easy explanation. There are roughly 37 identifiable images, many grouped closely together, etched into the sandstone with such clarity that even today, some are immediately recognizable, and yet no one agrees on what they mean. The site is protected today under Ohio History Connection with a wooden shelter built above the rock to shield it from rain and snow. Interpretive signs offer conservative estimates. The carvings likely date to between 1000 and 1650 CE, possibly made by ancestors of the fort ancient culture. That time frame overlaps with the late woodland and early Mississippian periods, both known for their complex mound sites and widespread iconography. But Leo doesn't match those traditions exactly. It's not a mound, it's not near a village, it's not a burial site or a temple base. It's just a rock, set apart, covered with figures that look like they're acting something out. But the story? Still missing. Some scholars argue the petroglyphs are part of a narrative sequence, a myth being illustrated, perhaps for ceremonial or teaching purposes. Others see them as vision figures, stylized depictions of beings encountered during trance states, drawn not from physical observation, but from inner experience. Still others suggest the panel could have served as a boundary marker or spiritual checkpoint, especially given its placement near a natural gap in the landscape. The human figures are the most puzzling. Their proportions are off. Their gestures seem deliberate, but not symbolic in any way we understand. One figure has arms bent upward at 90 degrees, hands open, almost welcoming. Another stands near an abstract spiral, as if emerging from it. Are these gods, spirits, ancestors? The answers are not just unavailable, they may be inaccessible. Over the years, amateur interpreters have suggested everything from alien contact to ancient migration narratives. But most researchers agree, whatever the petroglyphs meant, They were carved with purpose and consistency. These weren't random doodles. They were expressions of something serious, cultural, cosmological, or emotional. Today, Leo Petroglyph stands as both artifact and artwork, suspended between museum piece and sacred ground. It's fenced, labeled, interpreted, and yet untouched in its core mystery. And just a few counties away, one of America's most iconic prehistoric sites rises from a wooded hilltop. Not a carving, but a serpent, coiled, massive, and aligned with the heavens, pointing directly to what we still don't know. 23. Serpent Mound. You don't see it at first. Standing on the ground, all you notice are gentle rises and dips in the grassy hilltop. Subtle, barely enough to trip over, but climb the observation tower and look down, and suddenly it appears, an earthen serpent, over 1,300 feet long, uncoiling across the ridge in sinuous, deliberate curves. Its body bends 7 times before ending in a coiled spiral tail. Its head is wide, flat, and shaped like it's about to devour an egg-shaped mound placed directly in its open jaws. This is Serpent Mound, and there is no other ancient structure in North America quite like it. Located in Adams County, Ohio, Serpent Mound is more than just a monument. It's a provocation, a challenge, a deliberately unsettling masterpiece of earthwork engineering that has refused to give up its meaning for over a century of serious academic study. The first confusion is its age. For decades, archaeologists attributed Serpent Mound to the Adena culture, dating it to around 500 BCE. That interpretation was based largely on proximity. There are Adena burial mounds nearby, and some stone tools found in the area. But in the 1990s, a new round of radiocarbon dating suggested a much more recent construction, around 1070 CE, aligning it instead with the Fort Ancient culture, which raises the next confusion. If Fort Ancient people built it, why does the iconography look nothing like theirs? No other Fort Ancient site includes anything remotely like Serpent Mound, no large-scale effigy mounds, no massive symbolic earthworks. It's an outlier, even among outliers. Some researchers now believe the site may have been used by Fort Ancient peoples but originally built earlier, possibly by Hopewell or Adena hands, and later modified. A multi-generational monument, a recycled ritual space, a layered expression of belief that transcended culture, and then there's the alignment. Serpent Mound's head is oriented to the setting sun on the summer solstice. Other coils align with lunar standstill points, the extreme positions of the moon over its 18.6-year cycle. That's not coincidence. That's astronomical precision on a scale rarely matched, even in later pre-Columbian architecture. Whoever built it knew the scale, and they knew how to root those cycles into the earth. But what does the serpent mean? Serpents appear across Native American cosmologies, often symbolizing fertility, the underworld, rivers, rebirth, or the boundary between worlds. Some suggest Serpent Mound marks a portal, a place where transitions happen, whether seasonal, spiritual, or otherwise. Others see it as a protective talisman, defending the sacred ridge on which it rests. And speaking of that ridge, it's no ordinary hill. Serpent Mound lies within the rim of a massive ancient impact crater, a geologically disturbed zone unlike anything else in Ohio. Was that coincidence? Or did the builders know they were placing their serpent atop a cosmic scar? Today, the site is protected by the Ark of Appalachia Preserve System and co-managed with the Ohio History Connection. There's a museum, a trail, interpretive signage, but no interpretation feels complete. The serpent just lies there, undisturbed, watching the sky curled around a secret that may never unwind. But travel northeast from the serpent, and you'll find a set of earthworks even more precise, aligned not to animals, but to the slow dance of the moon, a vast octagon, a ceremonial geometry so large it can only be fully seen from above, and so accurate even NASA scientists still marvel at it. 24. Newark Octagons, lunar standstill alignments. At first glance, the Newark earthworks look like an over-ambitious golf course, mounds shaped like circles and squares, pathways cut across flat Ohio farmland. But from the sky, the scale emerges, and at the heart of it all lies the Octagon earthwork, a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering whose full purpose remains one of the most tantalizing riddles in North American archaeology. Built between 100 BCE and 400 CE by the Hopewell culture, the Newark earthworks once covered over 4 square miles, making them one of the largest set of geometric earthwork in the world. The octagon itself is nearly 3,000 feet across and connects to a perfect circle via a wide, curving walkway known as the Via Sacra. The octagon has 8 precise sides, each one over 500 feet long, and inside it, a network of mounds forms a geometrical garden that seems almost impossible in its precision. But here's what stops archaeologists cold. The octagon tracks the moon. Specifically, it aligns with the major lunar standstill, a rare astronomical event that occurs once every 18.6 years, when the moon rises and sets at its most extreme northern and southern points on the horizon. If you stand at the observatory mound within the octagon on the night of a major lunar standstill, the moon will rise along the axis of the earthwork, framed perfectly by its embankments. This isn't a vague coincidence. It's accurate to within half a degree. How did Hopewell engineers, with no metal tools or written language, calculate this? How did they plan, survey, and construct such a vast and exacting design? No one knows. Modern astronomers and engineers have studied the site and confirmed the alignment. Some have even suggested it may be the most complex prehistoric lunar observatory in the world, and yet no texts, no sky maps, no inscriptions, just earth and silence. What's more unsettling is the purpose. If the octagon was an observatory, it wasn't just for watching, it was for participating. The alignments suggest ceremony, procession, meaning embedded in motion. The people who used this site weren't just charting the moon, they were aligning themselves to it, tying human ritual to celestial rhythm. And there's more. The entire Newark complex includes perfect squares, giant circles, and long processional avenues, all built at scales that suggest advanced knowledge of geometry, surveying, and perhaps even abstract cosmology. None of the structures were defensive. None were residential. These were not for survival. They were for understanding. Today, parts of the octagon are used, controversially, as a golf course. The earthworks remain, but their sanctity has long been compromised. A recent UNESCO World Heritage designation has sparked hope for deeper protection and study, but the full story still eludes us. And yet, just down that ancient sacred path, another enigma waits, not a structure, but a road, and seen invisible, theoretical, and possibly mythical highway that may have once connected the minds and rituals of Hopewell cities across hundreds of miles. 25. Hopewell ceremonial earthworks. Step away from the octagon, and the mystery doesn't end. It multiplies because the octagon is just one piece of a larger, more staggering puzzle known as the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks, a network of geometric enclosures, massive mounds, and ritual landscapes built by the Hopewell culture across southern and central Ohio between 100 BCE and 400 CE. These sites are not only vast in scale, they're deliberate in form. Giant circles, precise squares, walled avenues, and earth-bound echoes of cosmic patterns stretch across the landscape like messages left behind in topography. They are now recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, an overdue validation of their architectural and cultural brilliance. But recognition is not the same as comprehension. Take the earthworks in Chillicothe, specifically Mound City. It's a complex of over 20 mounds arranged within a square embankment, all of them thought to be mortuary in purpose. Excavations in the early 20th century revealed the remains of cremated individuals beneath some mounds, along with elaborate grave goods, mica cutouts, obsidian blades from the Rockies, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, copper artifacts shaped into intricate forms. The objects suggest not just status or belief, but connection. Hopewell was not a civilization of cities. It was a civilization of ideas, passed through hands and rivers, encoded into artifacts and geometry. But other sites, like the High Bank Works or the Hopeton earthworks, contain no burials at all, just shapes, precision carved into the land, too large to see from the ground. Circles and squares built at a scale where you have to be airborne or in another frame of reference to fully grasp them. A recurring ratio across sites has been noted, circles and squares that are proportionally linked with dimensions repeated across different valleys, as if following a shared blueprint. The implication, communication, planning, a ritual logic that extended far beyond local villages. No one lived at these earthworks full time. There are no post holes, no hearths, no waste pits. These were ceremonial centers, places of gathering, movement, and mystery. Some researchers believe they were pilgrimage destinations tied to solstices, lunar cycles, and social renewal. Others suggest they were constructed as part of massive rituals involving regional networks of kinship and cosmology. Still, key questions remain unanswered. Why squares and circles? Why these ratios? Why build these shapes in open land using only wooden tools and sheer labor? The Hopewell left no written language, no codices, no carved warnings or invitations, just patterns in the soil. And the further we step back, the more those patterns seem to echo something enormous, something that suggests not just ceremonial practice, but a cosmic order rendered in topography. It's a vision of landscape as scripture, ritual as architecture, meaning not inscribed in words, but in walking paths, sight lines, and celestial rhythms. And if these sites were temples of connection, then the next mystery may have been their holy highway, if it existed at all. A ghost road, visible only in fragments, that may have once stitched two sacred centers together with unbroken intent. 26. The Great Hopewell Road. It begins with a line, a suspiciously straight line, noticed not by ancient pilgrims, but by 20th century aerial archaeologists, a corridor 200 feet wide that seems to stretch from Newark to Chillicothe, two of the most significant Hopewell ceremonial centers in Ohio. Not a natural ridge, not a random clearing, but a road, or at least the memory of one. This is the enigma known as the Great Hopewell Road, a hypothesized ancient causeway that may have connected Newark's lunar-aligned octagon with the mound complexes in Chillicothe, some 60 miles to the southwest. If true, it would be one of the longest prehistoric roads in the Americas, rivaling anything built in the Andes or Mesoamerica, and yet we can't prove it exists. The theory rests on fragments, parallel earthen walls visible in some early maps and aerial photos, especially near Newark. They extend southwest, remarkably straight, through farmland and development, then vanish. But archaeological test excavations have found some consistency. Ditches, berms, and soil changes consistent with a constructed causeway, not for carts, not for trade, but for procession. The Hopewell weren't urban. They didn't build cities, but they built roads, if this is one, and the purpose was likely ceremonial. A straight path between two major earthwork complexes implies movement of people, of ritual, of ideas. Some researchers suggest the road was walked during solstice ceremonies or funerary processions. Others argue it may have held mythic meaning, a terrestrial reflection of a celestial path, but only short segments remain. Most of it has been destroyed by agriculture, roads, housing, and time. There's no conclusive physical line connecting Newark and Chillicothe, just the echo of one. It's an archaeological phantom, confirmed in parts, imagined and whole. And that's what makes it so haunting, because the idea of the Great Hopewell Road forces us to confront the possibility that the Hopewell world was not a loose network of ritual spaces, but a deeply interconnected spiritual infrastructure, not cities, but ceremonial cities, not trade, but pilgrimage, and not random mounds, but waypoints on a map we've lost the key to. Today, the Great Hopewell Road is still a theory, one supported by landscape archaeology, satellite imagery, and oral speculation, but not yet by a complete excavation. And maybe that's appropriate. A road that once linked the heavens to the earth shouldn't give up all its secrets in a single trench, but the landscape holds more. To the southeast, a cluster of enigmatic circular enclosures and mounds still rests in Appalachian foothills, shapes that whisper of ancient math, invisible orders, and a purpose that remains as elusive as the road itself. 27. Wolf Plains Group. First glance, Wolf Plains doesn't look like a sacred site. It looks like a small town with a confusing number of traffic circles. The unincorporated community of the Plains in Athens County, Ohio, is home to houses, businesses, gas stations, and scattered among them, half hidden behind fences and trees, are mounds, lots of them, silent grassy domes sitting quietly between driveways and playgrounds. These are the remnants of the Wolf Plains Group, a collection of over 30 circular earthworks and conical mounds attributed to the Adena culture, dating from around 800 BCE to 100 CE. It's one of the densest clusters of Adena ceremonial structures in the entire Ohio Valley, and yet most people drive right past them. Why so many mounds? And why here? That's the first mystery. The site sits in a wide, flat glacial outwash plain, a rare feature in the hilly folded terrain of Appalachian Ohio. This open expanse may have made it an ideal setting for ceremony, gathering, or visibility. The mounds are mostly small, 5 to 10 feet tall, and arranged in a curiously clustered pattern. Several are paired. Others form rough circles or arcs. Many are now partially eroded or disrupted by roads and development, but the original arrangement seems far from random. One theory is that Wolf Plains functioned as a regional ritual center for the Adena, possibly a place where dispersed kin groups came together seasonally to hold ceremonies, resolve disputes, trade, and mark cosmological events. The mounds may have served both mortuary and ceremonial functions, though only a handful have been professionally excavated. Those that have yielded cremated remains, tools, and exotic materials, hinting at a social complexity far greater than the simple appearance of the mounds might suggest. But the circular earthworks are the most intriguing. Unlike Mississippian plazas or Hopewellian geometric enclosures, these circles are smaller, more intimate, perhaps intended for specific rituals tied to the individual or clan rather than a pan-regional gathering. Still, the repetition of form suggests a common template, one not yet fully understood. Why replicate the same shape over and over in such a tight space? What was the logic of proximity, of repetition? And then there's the invisibility. Most of Wolf Plains is now privately owned. Subdivisions sit on top of ancient ceremonial grounds, mounds rise in backyards, some have been leveled, others survive only as barely perceptible rises in the ground. A few are marked with plaques, most aren't marked at all. The landscape speaks, but only in fragments. In recent years, efforts have been made to preserve and interpret what remains, but there's no visitor center, no centralized protection, and no cohesive archaeological narrative tying the group together. It's a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces lost, and some pieces probably never meant to fit, but the mystery remains. Why here? Why so many? Why so consistent? And just downriver, another mound stands with singular gravity, a towering earthwork that refuses to be forgotten, not hidden, not erased, but prominently placed in a cemetery filled with America's early settlers, a Native American monument tucked into a colonial town square, and still watching. 28. Marietta's Conus, Great Mound. In the heart of Marietta, Ohio, where the Muskingum River joins the Ohio, an ancient mound rises from the carefully mown grass of Mound Cemetery. At nearly 30 feet tall and over 100 feet in diameter, it dominates the landscape, standing as a sentinel amid rows of gravestones bearing names from the American Revolution. They call it Conus, Latin for cone, and it is one of the most visible and best preserved Adena mounds in the country. But visibility doesn't mean understanding. The mound predates the cemetery by nearly 2 millennia. Built by the Adena people sometime between 800 BCE and 100 CE, it likely served as a burial mound, though its precise contents remain partly unverified. Early accounts suggest that log tombs were once embedded within its core, and small excavations on nearby mounds in the same complex revealed cremations and elaborate grave goods. But the central mound has largely remained intact, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fear of what lies beneath. The cemetery around it tells a different story. Rows of 18th and 19th century gravestones, many of them belonging to Revolutionary War officers, Ohio Company founders, and early settlers. In a stark and unsettling juxtaposition, the dead of two vastly different worlds lie side by side, the prehistoric and the colonial, the forgotten and the memorialized. This wasn't an accident. The city of Marietta was planned in the late 1700s by veterans of the American Revolution who were also amateur antiquarians. When they arrived, they recognized the earthworks for what they were, monuments, and deliberately preserved some of them while building their town around them. But preservation didn't equal comprehension. The early settlers wrote romantic theories about mound builders, often assigning the structures to a lost white race or to distant transoceanic travelers, any explanation except the indigenous peoples still living nearby. In truth, Conus is likely part of a larger Adena ceremonial landscape that once spanned much of the Marietta River Valley. Several smaller mounds, ditches, and embankments have been documented over the centuries, though many have been lost to development. What remains today is a partial glimpse into a highly structured ritual world, a world where burial was not just intermission but transformation. The proportions of Conus follow a certain recurring Adena logic: height to base ratios, alignment with nearby water, and visibility from surrounding terrain. It wasn't just built to bury, it was built to be seen, to mark the landscape as sacred, to remind those who passed by that the dead were not gone, they were elevated, and in a sense, they still are. Today, Mound Cemetery is considered one of the oldest continuously used burial grounds in the Northwest Territory. Tourists come to see the graves of American heroes, but they leave with a glimpse of something far older, far stranger, and just downriver, carved into the stone itself, another face waits, a face that emerged from the water only to disappear again, part artifact, part battleground, part accusation, a carved head whose origins still provoke argument every time the river runs low. 29. Indian Head Rock. Sometimes a mystery doesn't sit in a museum or behind a fence. It surfaces from a riverbed with mud in its ears and politics clinging to its back. Indian Head Rock is exactly that kind of mystery. It's a sandstone boulder weighing around 8 tons, once lodged in the shallows of the Ohio River near South Shore, Kentucky, just across from Portsmouth, Ohio. For over a century, it lay half submerged, visible only when the river ran low. But when it did, people claimed to see a face staring up from the stone, a human face, not carved in modern times, but something older, something stranger. The rock became a local curiosity in the 19th century. Newspapers referenced it. Swimmers visited it, some carved their names into it, but it wasn't until the 20th century that serious debate began about whether the face was prehistoric or merely a case of weathered pareidolia, a natural shape mistaken for art, or alternatively, a face carved by bored teenagers in the 1800s and mistaken for ancient iconography by equally bored historians in the 1900s. And that more or less is where the story splits in two. One version says the carving is ancient, Native American in origin, possibly a representation of a spirit, ancestor, or territorial marker. Proponents of this theory point to the general style. The head has a broad forehead, pronounced eyes, and appears to be pecked into the stone using a technique consistent with other known indigenous petroglyphs in the region. They argue that the position, facing the water, placed in a liminal space between land and river, is characteristic of indigenous ceremonial logic, where water often serves as a boundary between worlds. The other version says the carving is historic, created sometime in the mid to late 1800s, perhaps by riverboat workers or local residents. This camp cites the graffiti that surrounds the face, names, initials, and dates ranging from the 19th to early 20th centuries. If people were carving those marks at the time, who's to say they didn't carve the face too? In 2007, the rock made headlines not for its mystery, but for its relocation. A group from Kentucky retrieved it from the riverbed and hauled it to shore for display. Ohio officials were furious. Lawsuits followed, accusations of theft, desecration, and improper excavation were thrown around like river silt. In the end, the rock was returned to storage, its fate undecided, its mystery unresolved, and its symbolism stronger than ever, because Indian Head Rock isn't just a carved stone, it's a battle over ownership, of memory, of history, of who gets to define meaning in a place layered with centuries of occupation and forgetting. Is the face ancient? Maybe. Is it modern? Also, maybe. But the deeper truth might be this: it doesn't matter. The fact that people see something in it, something that stares back, just barely above the waterline, makes it part of the mythic landscape. And just a few counties away, another stone was shaken loose, this time not by water, but by gravity. A boulder fell from a Kentucky cliff in the 990s, revealing a cluster of markings that no one was expecting to find, symbols that sparked more than curiosity, they sparked controversy. 30. Red Bird, Manchester Petroglyph Boulder. In December 1994, a massive sandstone boulder dislodged from a bluff above Manchester, Kentucky, crashing down near a roadside along U.S. Route 421. That alone would have been interesting, geologically at least, but what emerged from the dust wasn't just fractured stone. It was a petroglyph-covered surface inscribed with over a dozen distinct symbols, many of them unlike anything else in the Appalachian archaeological record. Local accounts quickly dubbed it the Red Bird Boulder, named after a legendary Cherokee figure, Chief Red Bird, whose memory lingers in the hills of southeastern Kentucky. Some claim the boulder bore his name. Others believed it marked his death site, but once archaeologists got a look, the mystery only deepened. The markings were not a uniform script. Some resembled pre-contact Native American symbols, such as crosses, spirals, and zoomorphic forms, but others were more complicated. One resembled what appeared to be Hebrew script. Another looked like Iberian writing. Still others were vaguely Tifinagh, a script used by the ancient Berbers of North Africa. In short, it looked like a stone pulled from a Dan Brown novel. Within weeks, competing theories sprang up. Some argued that the boulder was evidence of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, that ancient seafarers from Europe, Africa, or the Near East had somehow reached Kentucky and left inscriptions on this now famous stone. Others dismissed the whole thing as a hoax or misinterpretation, perhaps the result of imaginative rock hounds projecting meaning onto natural weathering patterns or more recent graffiti. But here's where things got even stranger. The boulder didn't seem to match any known system of writing. It was as if multiple alphabets had been jumbled together and scattered across the surface. Some symbols were neatly etched, others appeared rough, incomplete, or deliberately obscured. No one could say definitively whether they were carved at the same time or if this was a multi-period artifact. The official line from the Kentucky Heritage Council? Indeterminate origin, and that might be the most honest answer. The Red Bird boulder now sits encased in a protective glass shelter near the city of Manchester, moved from its original resting place for preservation. Visitors come, peer through the glass, take photos, and leave more confused than they arrived. Interpretive signs attempt neutrality, but the whispers persist. Was this an ancient world traveler's message, a native holy stone, a prank, a prophecy, or more troubling still, what if it's all three? Whatever the answer, the boulder has become a symbol, not just of what we don't know, but of how quickly a mystery can become a mirror. Everyone sees what they want to see, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. But if stones can surprise us, so can caverns, and hidden deep within the limestone corridors of Kentucky is subterranean mystery that has nothing to do with writing, but everything to do with silence, death, and ancient industries we barely understand. 31. Mammoth Cave, Mummies and Mining. Beneath the rolling hills of south central Kentucky lies a subterranean realm so vast it feels less like a cave and more like an underground continent. Mammoth Cave is the longest known cave system in the world, stretching for over 400 miles and still counting. But its significance isn't just geological, it's archaeological. Hidden within these limestone corridors are traces of human activity that predate recorded history and provoke some of the most enduring questions in American prehistory. Long before Mammoth Cave became a tourist attraction or a national park, it was a place of ancient industry. Excavations have revealed extensive prehistoric mining activity, dating back over 4,000 years, where indigenous peoples extracted gypsum, epsomite, and other minerals from deep within the cave, not near the entrance, deep, as in miles in. This is what baffles researchers. The miners used cane torches, wooden tools, and stone implements. They navigated dark, narrow passages, sometimes crawling, sometimes climbing, always surrounded by the total, oppressive silence of deep earth. There were no maps, no light except what they brought. And yet they returned again and again, generation after generation, to dig in the dark. Why? Some have suggested the minerals were used for ceremonial purposes, body paint, rituals, medicine. Others argue for more practical uses. But whatever the motivation, the scale of the work is astonishing. Thousands of pounds of material were removed. Entire galleries of the cave were scraped smooth. This wasn't incidental. It was intentional, organized, and persistent. But then came the mummies. In the early 1800s, when white settlers and amateur explorers began probing the cave more aggressively, they discovered several remarkably well-preserved human remains, naturally mummified by the cool, dry cave air. These individuals, dated to the Archaic and Woodland periods, were found with tools, food remains, woven textiles, and even wooden litters. In some cases, the cause of death appeared accidental, collapsed ceilings, cave-ins. In others, the context was more ambiguous. The discovery of these remains caused a sensation in the 19th century, fueling a national obsession with mound builders and exotic ancient races. Some even speculated that the mummies were Egyptian or Phoenician, imported across oceans to tunnel beneath Kentucky. Needless to say, those theories have not aged well. The people who mined Mammoth Cave were indigenous Americans, skilled, persistent, and operating within a cultural system we still don't fully understand. Modern archaeology has confirmed their tools, torches, and pathways, but their purpose remains elusive. Why go so deep? Why mine in total darkness when similar minerals exist, closer to the surface. What was the symbolic or cosmological meaning of descending into the Earth's body to remove pieces of it? There are no carvings, no petroglyphs, no visible shrines, just tunnels, soot, footprints, and the quiet, unsettling sense that the cave was more than just a resource. It was an interface, a place where something happened, something that left no words behind, only the echo of breath against limestone. But outside of the darkness, up in the hills of South Carolina, another carved panel stares back at us, etched in sunlight instead of shadow, a flat rock etched with figures that hint at ritual, power, and something else, something still very much alive in symbol, even if the story is gone. 32. Haggard Creek Petroglyph Site. In the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, just outside Pickens, South Carolina, an ancient sandstone boulder rests inside a modest barn-like building, a structure that feels more like a forgotten museum than a temple of mystery. Inside that building lies the Haggard Creek Petroglyph Site, home to one of the most curious and least understood rock art panels in the entire southern Appalachians. The petroglyphs were discovered in the 90s during construction work near Haggard Mill, a 19th century water-powered grist mill now preserved as a heritage site. Workers uncovered a large rock panel bearing more than 30 carved figures, mostly anthropomorphic, meaning human-like, but not exactly human. These aren't stick figures. They're stylized with long torsos, outstretched arms, radiating lines, and exaggerated heads. Some appear to be dancing, others standing in poses of invocation or dominance. Local archaeologists were stunned. South Carolina isn't exactly known for elaborate petroglyphs, and the style didn't match what was expected for the region. No nearby village site, no mound complex, no clear cultural context, just a rock and symbols. The carvings have been tentatively dated to somewhere between 1000 and 1500 CE, likely attributed to ancestors of the Cherokee or neighboring woodland period cultures. But even those connections are speculative. Oral traditions in the area are quiet about the site, and that silence is its own kind of statement. Interpretations vary wildly. Some researchers believe the figures represent shamans or ceremonial dancers, perhaps immortalized in ritual poses. Others think they could be spirit beings, visualized during trance or vision quests. A few even speculate that the panel was used as an astronomical calendar, though the evidence for this is circumstantial at best. What's notable is the repetition. Several figures share identical forms, almost like stencils. Were they meant to be read together? Are they part of a narrative, a ritual sequence, a prayer? And then there's the setting. The boulder now sits indoors under artificial lighting, protected from the elements, but originally it would have been exposed, possibly part of a larger ritual space that has since eroded or been buried. If so, then the petroglyphs we see now are only one panel in a longer, unwritten chapter. Today, the site is open to the public, but rarely crowded. Visitors can view the panel through glass flooring, illuminated from below. Interpretive signs attempt explanations, but the tone is careful. No one wants to claim too much. Because Haggard Creek doesn't give much away, the figures are bold but mute. The meanings resist translation. It's a site that feels more like a mirror than a message, reflecting whatever cultural framework you bring to it, then quietly questioning it. And just to the west, back into the mountains where three states blur into one, another stretch of cliffside hides a longer, deeper mystery, an entire corridor of painted and pecked images that spans centuries and resists boundaries. A ritual landscape not built, but scattered, as if the land itself was a canvas and the ceremony never really ended. 33. New River, painted pecked rock art corridor. There's no single GPS coordinate for this one. No gate, no parking lot, no name carved into wood. Instead, what we call the New River painted pecked rock art corridor is more of a scattered phenomenon, a trail of symbols, images, and carvings that stretch across the Alabama, North Carolina, Tennessee borderlands, loosely following the path of the ancient New River and its surrounding tributaries. These images aren't all on one rock. They're everywhere, etched into sandstone cliffs, painted high on bluffs, hidden in remote hollows, and they don't belong to one era. Some are more than 1,000 years old, others may be more recent, but they all share something essential. They're hard to find and even harder to explain. The corridor includes sites like Paint Rock on the North Carolina-Tennessee line and Painted Bluff in Alabama, both of which display rectilinear shapes, spiral forms, anthropomorphic figures, and mysterious grids painted in red, yellow, and black. Some motifs are geometric, crosses, boxes, lattices, while others are unmistakably alive, birds, human forms, hybrid creatures. What links them isn't just style, it's placement. These panels are often located in liminal zones, high bluffs, narrow gaps, places that are neither entirely land nor sky. Some require climbing to reach, others are only visible from the river during certain seasons. It's as if they were meant to be seen, but only by those who knew when and how to look. Interpretation is notoriously tricky. Archaeologists believe these sites were ritual in nature, possibly marking ceremonial travel routes or vision quest sites. The consistent appearance of abstract grids and maze-like forms has led some to speculate about shamanic navigation tools, visual aids for altered states meant to guide or disorient. Others see cosmological maps, clan symbols, or even proto-languages encoded in form, but no single explanation works for all of them. What makes the corridor remarkable is that it wasn't centralized. It wasn't a city or a mound complex. It was distributed, fragmented, a ritual landscape not confined to a spot, but stretched across miles like a mobile sacred zone, constantly shifting, constantly evolving. You didn't go to the ceremony, you moved through it. Today, many of these panels are endangered by erosion, by vandalism, by invisibility. Some are being documented using 3D scanning and pigment analysis. Others are simply fading away. A few have already vanished, remembered only in hand-drawn maps and decades-old photos. But the corridor is still there if you know where to look. A series of whispers carved into stone, painted in mineral, scattered like spiritual breadcrumbs through the oldest mountains in North America. It ends where it begins, in mystery, not one mystery, but dozens, stacked, layered, repeating, as if the land never stopped speaking, we just stopped listening.